On March 17, 1893, Olaf Olsen, a young Norwegian man of the lower classes, prepared to begin an arduous journey from Norway to the United States in hopes of receiving better economic opportunities. His hopes were furthered by nonsensical rumors regarding rivers flowing with milk and honey and trees that grew silver dollars circulating across Norway. However, after arriving in America, Olaf and others discovered that assimilating into American culture was challenging. Economic struggles in America existed on a grander scale in certain aspects. The lives of those living in Norway, the journeys of those who emigrated to America, and where those Norwegians ended up living are crucial in analyzing the cultural and economic differences between Norwegians in the United States and Norway. Norwegians immigrating to America from the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century were isolated from American culture due to their settlement in rural areas. The origin of this mass immigration can be traced back to 1821, when Clang Pearson first traveled to America. Clang was a natural-born pathfinder, as he was born in Rogaland, a town known for launching Viking expeditions. During the Napoleonic Wars, Clang was captured by British soldiers. On board the ship, he made contact with the Quakers. He began to question the state church on its restrictions. The contact with the Quakers opened Clang up to the New World and the inherent freedoms. Religious oppression did not enter into the subsequent emigration. Clang embarked on a journey to America to see if the rumors were true, with his mind set on the supposed religious freedom. Clang looked for new land in the Midwest in 1821 because he was under the impression that he was the first Scandinavian on the prairie west of Chicago. In 1824, he returned to Norway under the command of a group of New York Quakers and shared what he had learned about America. Clang Pearson enlisted the help of 53 Norwegian immigrants, known as sloopers, to travel to America and experience this religious freedom for themselves. The sloopers earned their nickname because they sailed on a sloop, a type of ship, and came to America for the sake of religious freedom. The Restoration, a famous sloop, landed in New York on October 9, 1825, at Kendall County in upstate New York, with a boatload of 53 immigrants after a 14-week journey. This new connection established between the two countries resulted in an overwhelming feeling of American fever on the southwestern coast of Norway from 1840 to 1865. The spark of Norwegian immigration came from pioneers such as Clang Pearson and those seeking religious freedom from the Lutheran Church. At the time, Norway did not have a separation between church and state. This meant that Lutheranism had already been established and was encouraged by the law. In Norway, the laws and practices considered that the only way to build a Christian society was to establish one genuine church. However, there were schisms within Norway's church. The orthodoxy of the state church indicated a deep concern for Lutheran doctrine. There was an emphasis on the value of personal religious experience. The forms and procedures of the state church and the clergy who represented it were frequently criticized by those who felt the impact of the spiritual awakenings. Many Lutheran pietists and Quakers emigrated to avoid persecution by the Lutheran clergy since they were defying the church's law. This led to an estimated 1 million Norwegians emigrating from Norway between 1820 and 1920. As a result, Norway lost a higher proportion of its population to the United States than any other country, except for Ireland. Famine and crop failures, which resulted in harsh economic conditions in Norway, caused widespread sentiment to leave for the United States. In the 1840s, Europe was struck by a potato famine that impacted both Ireland and Northern Europe. The leading cause of the potato failures was the presence of a disease known as late blight. This destroys the leaves and roots of the potato. This famine, which reached Norway, forced many to emigrate to the United States in hopes of better chance at survival and providing for families. Low wages in Norway, which resulted from famine, also played a role in immigration to the United States. About 600,000 people left Norway to settle overseas in the next half-century, almost all in the United States of America. Norway experienced a more significant population migration than any other European country in the 19th century, except for Ireland and, beginning in the 1890s, Italy. 3 significant emigration waves occurred. The first one lasted from 1866 to 1873, and it displaced 111,000 people, or 63.42% of Norway's birth-to-death ratio. The second and most significant wave lasted from 1879 to 1893. More than 250,000 Norwegians emigrated to other countries, accounting for more than 2/3 of the birth-to-death ratio. Between 1900 and 1910, there were over 200,000 emigrants, accounting for 59.7% of the excess of births over deaths. After Cleng Pearson established a path for immigration between Norway and the United States, immigrants began to flood into the United States. One such immigrant was Olaf Olsen, a Norwegian man born on September 15, 1873, in Oslo. Olaf was the oldest child and came from a low-income family who had no voice in government. The only school he could attend in Norway was a church school, where they read Catholic texts such as the Catechism and the Bible. Wealthier children attending the school often received higher ranks. However, Olaf managed to rank second in his class out of roughly 200 students. Although the most popular industries in Norway at the time were fishing and sailing, Olaf decided to pursue painting. However, Olaf discovered, just as many others had, that wages were extremely low in Norway. His uncle Andreas, who had recently immigrated to the United States, suggested that he should also. Olaf learned that he would have to work just as hard in the United States as he did in Norway to make the same amount of money. The journey from Norway to the United States was far from easy. During Olaf's trip to America, he was surprised to find how unsanitary conditions on the ship were. Olaf, a third-class passenger, describes how the majority of the passengers were seasick. Those passengers who had trouble standing were laid out into rows. Furthermore, there were many stops on the way to the United States because of continent-wide sentiment for immigration. Although the journey was grueling, the high expectations of the Norwegian immigrants for living in America propelled them through even the worst situations. Olaf eventually landed in the Grand Forks of North Dakota after passing by Canada and Minneapolis. After their rigorous journeys, the mass number of Norwegian immigrants needed a place to settle. The first town for Norwegian immigration was Kendalltown, New York, but the Midwest became a hotspot for Norwegian immigration as time passed. Those who still wanted to farm settled in North Dakota's eastern and northern regions. Some of the immigrants had lived in other states for a while before settling in North Dakota. Wisconsin had always been a popular destination for Norwegian immigration and would be a center for Norwegian immigration up until the Civil War. In 1850, there were 8,600 Norwegians in Wisconsin. By 1860, the number had risen to about 44,000. With its large number of Norwegian communities, the Rock River Basin became the hub of Norwegian settlement. Wisconsin was home to 25% of all Norwegians in America by 1900. As the center began to shift away from Wisconsin during the 1850s, Norwegians moved into Iowa, Minnesota, and North and South Dakota until 1870. The Homestead Act of 1862, signed by President Abraham Lincoln, furthered European settlement in the United States by allowing all Americans to claim 160 acres of open land. Although there were several requirements and fees that the landowner was forced to abide by, immigrants from Norway took advantage of the act and encouraged other Norwegians to immigrate. After arriving in North Dakota, Olaf Olsen tried to find a piece of land in accordance with the Homestead Act, but ended up being conned by a locator. Olaf left his newly bought land, but visited it twice a year in order to keep it. The terms of the Homestead Act stated that a homesteader could not be away from his claim for longer than 6 months. He later sold the land for $700. North Dakota was not the only place where Norwegian immigrants were buying this cheap land. Minnesota had the most significant number of landowning immigrants. This allowed Minneapolis to function as a cultural hub in America for secular and religious activities of Norwegians, and resulted in less Norwegian assimilation into the cultures of the United States. After arriving in the United States, most Norwegians settled in small, rural communities as opposed to large cities. This was because Norwegians were accustomed to farming and producing crops. In 1900, only a quarter of all Norwegian-born residents in the United States lived in towns with more than 25,000 inhabitants. This was the lowest percentage for any European immigrant population, meaning that Norwegian immigrants were generally isolated from major urban areas and had infrequent interactions with Americans and their culture. For example, 54.3% of the children of Norwegian immigrants were farmers at this time. Farming was a primary occupation for Norwegians in their homeland, which provides a sense of how little assimilation took place between American and Norwegian culture. Industrialization was prevalent in the United States for over 3 decades before the beginning of the 20th century. Businesses began to expand at the end of the 19th century due to the creation of new products, production methods, a large abundance of natural resources, and population growth. However, assimilation failed to take place within urban areas for Norwegian immigrants. Many of those who had remained to see the cities grow from a few dozen shacks in 1840 to populations of over 100,000 by 1860 were dismayed at how difficult it was to preserve their native culture and religion. Larger Norwegian settlements began to spring up in southern Minnesota, fueled by cheap land. Back in Norway, entire communities were often made up of Norwegians from the same area or even the same village. By 1870, 1,135 of the 1,200 inhabitants of Spring Grove, Texas County, were Norwegian, with the majority coming from the Hallingdal area northwest of Oslo. These ethnic enclaves, known as bygds, maintained the Old World social hierarchies and customs. Norwegian rural dialects could still be heard in small towns around the state well into the 20th century. By 1865, there were 5 separate synods of Norwegian American Lutheranism, each with its own doctrine and social standing. Synods were designated councils of the church. Immigrants argued that their town, or their respective synod, was the most prosperous, pious, and industrious, bringing old regional and religious rivalries from Norway to rural parts of America. These old religious rivalries made large urban Norwegian concentrations challenging to create, causing divided rural communities amongst Norwegians. For those who did live in urban areas such as Chicago in 1910, ethnic groups maintained an imaginary boundary between Norwegians and Americans. For example, 77% of married first-generation Norwegians had wed another Norwegian, and 46% of the married second-generation had chosen to marry within their ethnic group. This lack of assimilation and other factors caused Norwegians such as Olaf to struggle to obtain proper wages and living spaces. Once Olaf married Ella Ida Johnson, work and wages were plentiful. However, the Great Depression would hit in the 1920s, causing both high prices on goods and Olaf and his family to experience economic severity. Simultaneously, an epidemic of black measles erupted among children of all ages. Immigrants suffered worse than ever before and became increasingly isolated. Without a blend between the two cultures, Norwegian traditions were generally preserved and unaltered in the United States. Economic turmoil, religious persecution, and crop failures across Europe drove Norwegians in mass numbers out of Norway during the late 19th century. America became the central location for these immigrants seeking economic and religious freedom promised by prominent figures such as Clem Pearson. Immigrants battled through a long, arduous, and unsanitary journey through the Atlantic Ocean. After arriving in America, Norwegian immigrants maintained a similar lifestyle as they would have in Norway. The Homestead Act, signed by President Abraham Lincoln, allowed Norwegians to settle in rural locations in the Midwest. Although the standard states for Norwegian immigration fluctuated, one consistent factor was the lack of assimilation with Americans. While industrialization took place across America, Norwegian immigrants continued their agricultural methods. Because they were foreigners, finding occupations and earning money was a struggle at certain times, especially during the Great Depression. The stock market crash before the Great Depression resulted in many losing their jobs. One person who experienced this turmoil was Olaf Olsen, a Norwegian man from a less than privileged background who immigrated to the United States in the 1890s. Because Norwegians often stayed together after immigrating to the United States, they rarely assimilated with other cultures and consequently struggled extensively during periods of economic severity.